morning, everybody. Welcome to the Kickapoo Valley Reserve. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Maggie Schultz. I'm the education coordinator here, and we're really excited to have you here for our Driftless Dialogue series. This series is made possible and free to you thanks to a grant from the Ralph E. Nuzum Kickapoo Reforestation Fund and the UW-Madison College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, and also supported by Badger Talks and Friends of the Kickapoo Valley Reserve. Today we have Brad Herrick here, and he is going to be talking about the invasive jumping worm. So a little bit about his background. He is the ecologist and research program manager at the Madison Arboretum. His research interests include plant community ecology, invasion biology, and environmental monitoring. So he's going to be talking to you today about jumping worms. So thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you very much, Maggie. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you to KVR for having me. Thank you for all of you coming out on a unexpected, really nice day. No rain yet, so thanks for spending your morning here. So as Maggie said, I'm with the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. I'm the ecologist there. And over the last decade or so, I've been studying this new invasive group of earthworms, non-native invasive earthworms. Before I start, I have to kind of take a poll from the audience here. Who has heard of jumping worms? All right, that's a higher percentage than usual. Who knows that they have them in their garden, on their land, seen them? No, so just knowledgeable, but maybe, yeah. All right, so most of you are at least familiar with them. Some have personal experience with them, have seen them. Hopefully after this talk, you'll feel more comfortable with what they are, why we're kind of concerned about them from an ecological and from a gardening standpoint, what their impacts are, and then maybe what we can do about them. So we're going to start off, I'm going to kind of give an overview of this talk. We're going to start off with just basic earthworm biology 101, everyone's favorite topic. After this, you're going to just love earthworms. You're going to know all about them. We're going to spend most of the morning talking about jumping worms, right? How they're different from other earthworms. So we're all familiar with earthworms as a group generally, but these are very specific type of earthworms. Where are they? How do they impact our garden, soil, plants, forests? How do I know if I have them? How do I identify them? And then finally, what do I do about them, if anything, right? So, biology 101. So, it's first important to know that there are no native earthworms in areas that experienced glaciation during the last ice age. Now, you're probably wondering, well, we're in the driftless area here where there were no glaciers, but there are still, as far as researchers know, there are still no native earthworms in this part of Wisconsin, as far as we know. Now, there could be native earthworms that we just haven't found, but unlikely. So even though this particular spot of the upper Midwest wasn't covered with a glacier, 10,000 years ago, like most of the upper Midwest was, it could be that the climate during that period was not hospitable enough for earthworms to survive, and they were all, if there were native earthworms here, which there probably were, they were pushed to the south, right? And they haven't been able to come back that fast, right? They don't move very far. It could be that since we have other earthworms, like the night crawler and other species that are all from parts of Europe that came over with European settlement a few hundred years ago, that those earthworms outcompeted any native earthworms that were here, and that led to the extirpation of native earthworms. So, because there are native earthworms in parts of New England that either hung on during the last glaciation or were able to recolonize after the glaciers retreated. So, along the boundary of the glacier, the story is a little bit more complicated, but in general, earthworms that we see here are from parts of Europe. And the species are in this group called Lumbricidae. Again, it's an academic thing, doesn't really matter. But primarily they followed European settlement. Earthworms as a group, there's hundreds, thousands of earthworms globally. But biologists like to categorize them by where they live, where they burrow in the soil profile. So we have three different general groups. We have this top group called epigeic, or the litter dweller. So these are earthworms that spend their entire time either in that organic layer, whether it's the fallen leaves in a forest or a mulch pile or whatever organic layer you have on top of the soil. They're hanging out just there. They're not even going into the soil. They're just happy to live in that high organic layer. There's this middle group, this top soil dwelling group called endogeic. And they are in the soil, but only maybe a few inches. So they're in that topsoil, that really rich topsoil. And then, you guessed it, there's this other group called the subsoil dwellers, or anisic. And so if you think of the common nightcrawler, the really big ones that are used for fishing bait, those are the most common deep-dwelling earthworms. And they'll burrow down several feet. And a lot of these will like these earthworms can burrow down below the frost line, and so they'll survive over winter just below the frost line and then come back up. Now, jumping worms are a different type of earthworm that actually spans these two groups. So they are what we call epiendogeic, just kind of a hybrid. So they can be perfectly happy in the leaf litter, but they can also go down into the soil. Right now, they are almost entirely within the moist leaf litter when they're little. But as they grow and they need more moisture, as it kind of dries out during the summer, they will burrow down into the topsoil. But they're not going to go deep. So they're doing all their work within the topsoil and that litter layer. So that's kind of where we're going to be talking about with jumping worms. Earthworms generally are referred to as ecological engineers, or keystone species, if you've heard those terms, because they can have a profound impact on broad ecosystem processes just by what they do to the soil. So through their burrowing activity, their feeding, their casting behavior. So casts are the earthworm's excrement. When they eat food, they produce little granular casts, and so that changes kind of the soil structure. When they die, they decompose really rapidly and put nutrients back into the environment. So they can have these physical changes to the soil, these chemical changes to the soil that can affect other flora and fauna that's in the soil. And so given how, they're small creatures, obviously, but they can be at a high abundance, and then they can, changing that soil changes the plants that grow, changes how water moves through the system, and that affects entire ecosystems. So they're a really important species to a lot of different ecosystems. A lot of what we know about earthworms has, especially in North America, is what we've learned from their invasions into forests. Primarily like sugar maple dominated forests. So on this slide, the left-hand side of the slide, we have a forest that is intact. So very little earthworms, and really no invasive species per se. So think of it as quote unquote pristine forest. You've got this really thick, see if I can get this to work. Yeah, this really thick, I'm not sure that's working. Anyways, the leaf layer, this what we call duff layer. So you have this annual input of leaves that fall to the forest floor, and they build up over time. They decompose slowly, and it makes this really rich organic layer. And that's really important for understory plants to grow from. It's high in nutrients, retains moisture, kind of like mulch in a garden, right? And you've got really distinct soil layers. There's no mixing of soil. And that soil layer and that duff layer helps trees to grow. It covers the roots, and it promotes kind of species diversity. A lot of plants can do well in there. When earthworms move in, and after a time, when you have all these groups of earthworms, you see the deep soil dwellers, the ones that are just at the surface, they, as you know, they mix soil rapidly. They eat the organic layer, that thick duff layer that's on the soil. They eat that up, that's their food. And so what you're left with is a really kind of homogenized soil and no organic matter on the soil, on top of the soil. And that's not very hospitable for native plants, a lot of forest floor organisms like salamanders, ground nesting birds that need that sort of soil floor structure. And so you get some plants that can survive, but a lot of those are other non-native species, like you might have heard of buckthorn and honeysuckle, garlic mustard, all these plants that we have grown to know, unfortunately. And so there's this sort of this feedback. There's like this cycle of when these earthworms move in, again, they're kind of ecosystem engineers. They change the environment, and that allows plants to move in that would not normally be there. Is there a question? Yeah. Right, that's a good question. So the question was lightly infested with earthworms versus heavily infested. And so there is sort of a linear sequence of invasion that we see. We often get species moving in that are, with the European species, that are upper layer invaders first. So they'll come in and they'll kind of change that upper layer of organic matter first. And that increases the likelihood of those subsoil dwellers coming in and the other species that move in that can dig into the ground more. And so after a year or two of the first invasion, it opens up the woods, and in this case, for other species to move in that can move into broader soil layers.
Yeah. Another question.
Yes.
So, do you have a timeline for light infestation to heavy infestation?
It depends on the site, but it's usually on the order of 3 to 5 years from initial invasion, where you're going to get more species moving in. But it really depends on the source of the invasion, what those species groups are like, and so it can be anywhere from a few years to a decade or more, depending on the site. Yep, that's a good question. Yeah. So, you're all now earthworm experts. You know everything there is to know about earthworms. And so we're going to jump into jumping worms, and that's a pun intended there. So these are an entirely different group of earthworms. So as I mentioned, the ones that we have in North America, predominantly, the really common ones, are mostly from Europe, generally. These jumping worms are from parts of Asia. So the ones that we have in Wisconsin are primarily from Japan. But as a group, they're Korean Peninsula, parts of China, other parts of Eastern Asia. That's where they're endemic to. So different parts of the world. The most common genus is Amenthus, and I put that up there just so you hear that word. It took me a long time to figure out how to say that word. So Amenthus is the genus, again, kind of academic, but it's good to know what we're talking about in terms of the species or the genus. And it's a big group. There's hundreds of species of this genus worldwide. And the three most common species that we have in North America, and particularly in Wisconsin, are these three species. And I'll just say their names so you're familiar with the names. Amenthus tokyoensis. And that's kind of the smaller one, so 3 to 5 inches is how big that one is. Amenthus agrestis, which can be 5 to 7 inches. And then taxonomists like to change things a lot in terms of naming. So now there's one called Metaphyre hilgendorfi, which used to be Amenthus. Now it's Metaphyre. It doesn't matter. They're really similar. But those are the big ones. Those can be 10 inches long, a big earthworm. So it's kind of academic. They look similar except for the different lengths. They live in the same part of the soil, but you might find them together. They tend to co-invade. And we don't know why exactly, but they are different species, but besides their length, they look really similar. And we'll get into more identification here. Two things to note. Again, I mentioned all three are epiendogeeic. So if we go back to that first slide, they are in the litter layer, but also they'll go into the soil, and they're all parthenogenic. So that means that they can produce offspring without a mate. So in a way, they're not truly asexual, but they can produce cocoons without a mate. So if you have one mature jumping worm, that gets moved to a new area, in theory, that one individual can start a population. They can produce cocoons, they can produce jumping worms, they can produce more cocoons, more earthworms. So that's a big difference between some of the European species and why we're even a little more concerned about this group in terms of their ability to spread quickly. Okay. So where are these right now? Well, if we take a kind of a continental look at their spread, this is a map from iNaturalist, if you're familiar with that. It's a online kind of citizen science platform. So these are just observations that were on iNaturalist between 2008 and 2018, so that 10-year span. And so you can see that they've been present in North America, for a while, but pretty sparse. Now, like any citizen science data, it's really are you actively looking for this? So they are definitely more common than what this map suggests. But this is sort of the baseline that we have at this scale. And then I looked at the data from 2018 to present, and this is what we see. So a lot more observations, and the scale of this is more than just sort of observation bias. There's more people were probably looking for them, but even so, the spatial extent of this suggests that the invasion was increasing. And so you see New England, basically the eastern half of the U.S. now, very common. And then there's this gap, and then west of the Rocky Mountains, on the coast, there's also a big invasion, and then now moving into Canada. And so what that tells me is that they're being moved by us, right? They're being moved. They're not just traveling over land by themselves as an earthworm. They're being transported, which is how invasive species move, right? They're being transported through the plant trade, through garden products, through who knows? On there's a lot of mechanisms for them to spread. So they're able to move quickly through us, likely through humans. And just in terms of kind of what we know about the habitats that they like, again, the research is just now coming out on this, and I've been involved in a lot of some of this work as well. But we know that, not surprising, the type of climate and the type of soil is really important predictors in determining where jumping worms are and where they might move to. So we know that precipitation is important. Jumping worms don't do well on extreme ends of precipitation. So they don't do well in dry periods. So, I think the weather here, the climate here is very similar to Madison, obviously, and it's been dry. It was dry last year, dry the year before, and there was a huge decline in the abundance of jumping worms at the sites that I study. They also don't do well in flooding conditions, right? So they like sort of, average, if you will, moisture levels. They also don't do well in high calcium soils. So, a lot of earthworms, European earthworms, have these calciferous glands where they can remove calcium from the soil. Like they don't need a lot of calcium in their diet, and so they are able to remove calcium from the soil that they're consuming. Where jumping worms, they don't have those glands, and so they're not going to be in sort of high calcium soil. So that was a predictor if soil that has less calcium will be more hospitable to jumping worms than soil that has high calcium. So that's just something that this study found. What's interesting about this too is that the type of land cover, so forest versus garden, different types of forests, prairies, those kind of habitats, didn't really matter. So which tells us that they're kind of a generalist species. They can do well in different forest types. They can do well in a mulch pile, on the side of your house, in an old field. Whereas in their native range, they're really restricted to forest edges. They're actually not in forests very often. They like that kind of disturbed edge. So jumping worms do well in urban environments and rural environments, different forest types, in gardens, in potted plants, for example. Yeah.
So is there that much difference between Asia and here in soil types, or why would they be able to live everywhere here but they don't there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and that's, with invasion species biology, that's often the question. We don't know, something they have been released from either predation here, or there's potentially like a soil bacteria, soil fungus relationship that is not present here. We don't know, yeah, and that's the case with a lot of organisms like that. There's a lot of hypotheses why that if they don't have the competition here with other invasive earthworms, they've found some niche here that is not present, because they're not actually overly abundant in their native range. They're common, but there's a lot of different groups. Yeah.
I apologize for coming late.
No, that's okay.
So probably what I missed is, what are they good for back in Asia? They've got to be good for something, right?
Yeah.
They're not good here. We get that.
Yeah.
Back home, what are they good
That's a good question. They are certainly, they contribute to the broader food web. So they are food for animals, mammals, birds. And likely they're also food here, but at this point, the invasion is so new that they're not really, the animals are, from what I have understand, is they're not really used as a food source very much, because the animals are like,
for?
what is
No one
this?
brought in for a reason, like
No.
brought in the parsnips. No one brought in
Right,
to us,
right.
brought in for a reason.
This was not an intentional introduction, whereas things like spongy moth was brought in for silk. Buckthorn for hedgerows, and so that kind of thing. So this was, as far as we know, was sort of an accidental introduction.
And then my second question,
Yep.
I'm sure you covered this.
No, that's okay.
Maybe for me and Susan, this will help. Is you mentioned the European earthworms. So were there no earthworms here, just like there was no honeybees here?
Right.
Before the white people came?
Yep. Now, there are native earthworms in other parts of North America without the glaciations. That's the glaciers, like I mentioned earlier, the glaciers wiped out native earthworms, but Southern Illinois, native earthworms. Parts of Southeast has a lot of native earthworms. So there are native earthworms in the U.S., but not in the upper Midwest. All right, so I'm going to talk about this study really quickly before we move on to specific jumping worm characteristics. But I did a study recently in urban Madison, and see that arrow is not correct. It should be in Madison. Sorry about that. So what this map is showing is Madison. The black shapes are different land cover types. So we did a survey just to find out in 2017 where these jumping worms were. So we surveyed forests in the city. We surveyed what we call grasslands, or basically like restored prairies in the city, open spaces, and then people's backyards that had a garden and lawn. And then we did the same survey, the exact same residential areas, habitats, 2 years ago to get a before and after, and then also added sort of rural habitats as well, the same type of habitats. And so the data, I'm just going to show the more urban habitats, what we found there. But basically, deciduous forests had jumping worms. Open space, so like turf grass, had jumping worms. They were not found at all in like prairies, grassland type areas, so basically with areas with tall grass. They were found in people's gardens, not surprisingly, and then lawns. So like if you had jumping worms in your garden, you probably also had them in adjacent turf grass lawns. 5 years later, they're still in those forests. They're still in the parks, the open spaces. They still haven't gotten into the grassland, so there's something there. And they're still in gardens and lawns. Now, that's one piece of data. So in terms of just like presence absence, they're still in the same habitats that they were 5 years ago, okay, and not in grasslands. But the number of sites change. So they increase their spread in forests. So they really do well in forests. And these are like maple forests, maple basswood forests. They also increased their numbers in lawns. So these were backyard lawns, right, that probably had them in a garden before, and then over time, over those 5 years, they crept out into a lawn. The number of open spaces, turf grass, went down. So that, to me, that kind of predicts that, or says that they can survive there, but it's not a preferred habitat, right? There's not a lot of food in a turf grass community for them. Whereas other earthworms, they're in lawns all the time, right? But these critters, they need a really kind of thick organic layer, because that's where they are often hanging out. And then there's no change in grasslands and gardens. Now, I mentioned that in 2022 and last year, it was pretty dry. We had drought conditions in southern Wisconsin. And jumping worms are very susceptible to moisture. They need moisture. And so the density was way down across the board. So they were still there, right? Still present, but their numbers were way down. And so something that, you know, as a researcher, I'm interested in that question, like, can we use this as a control? Can we think about drying soil, using something that we can, you know, sort of make the soil dry for a period of time that would cause the population to crash and not come back? But that's the trick. Is this just like a one-off where, okay, it's a dry season, they're down, but next year, if the moisture returns, they will also return? And that's, again, and does it matter what kind of habitat? If the moisture comes back in a forest, will that trigger more jumping worms to come back as well? And is that the case with gardens and lawns? So basically, they're consistently found in the same habitats, but their numbers change, probably based on the precipitation level that year. So one of the questions I get a lot is, and this is a hard one, it took me a long time to identify jumping worms versus other earthworms. And so I have this slide. We're going to run through some characteristics of each. Yeah, before I go on.
Would it be possible for the jumping worms to adapt to this climate in the soil?
100%. Yeah. So the question was, is it possible for jumping worms to adapt to this climate, these soil types? And I would say, based on the fact that they've been here now in Wisconsin for 10 years or so, they're already probably adapting. And really, the latitude where they're in, you know, the latitude of Japan, Korea is not that far off from where we are. Maybe it's slightly south. So it's already probably a good fit for them. The question was, for us, can they overwinter with our harsh winters, which we used to get harsh winters, except for the last few years. But they're moving north. And so we'll get to that part here in a second. But so this image, we have a typical jumping worm on the left. On the right-hand side, a typical European species. It's called Lumbricus rubellus. The red worm, it's not the red wiggler, which you've probably all heard of. It's a red worm. You may not know the name, but you've all seen it. Both of these are epiendogic, so they could be found in the same part of the soil, which is why I thought it'd be good to compare and contrast those groups. So here are some big differences for you to take note of to identify them. The first big difference is not a visual one, but it has to do with their life cycle. Jumping worms are, the ones that we have, are an annual species, which is pretty unique for an invasive species. So what's happening right now in April is they're all hatching from cocoons that are in the top soil, right? So right now they're about, that big, and they're within the moist leaf litter. They're not in the soil, generally, but if the moisture is what it usually is in the spring, they're gonna be in those leaves, consuming those leaves. They're gonna grow after about 90 days, they're gonna be mature, so they're gonna look like that earthworm, and then they're gonna start sloughing off cocoons. So they produce cocoon, which are you can think of like egg capsules. They have one little baby in each cocoon, and they have kind of a hard cover. Those cocoons, and so they're producing those cocoons once they're mature, and they'll produce them until the first really hard freeze. So that could be, who knows now when it is, but middle of October to November sometime. At that point, all the earthworms die. But those cocoons that they produce are in the soil and they overwinter. So they're winter hardy. And then the next generation will be, this time next year, those cocoons will hatch and start again. What we know now, though, is that there are some percentage of cocoons that don't hatch every year, and they produce kind of a cocoon bank, like a seed bank. And so even in a dry year, like we've had the last few years, there's still, even so if, let's say, the dry year prevents cocoons from being formed, or the earthworms don't mature because it's dry and they die off, there's still this cocoon bank from the previous year that will sustain the population for the next year. So they're an annual species, but their cocoons can be, think of them as like a perennial, like a seed bank, right?
Have you found anything that kills the cocoons?
No, that's a very good question. Unfortunately not, well, I'll take that back. There is, and it has to do with heat, and I'll be getting into that in a moment. That's a good question. Other earthworms, every earthworm produces cocoons, but the European species are able to overwinter and can live multiple years. So right now, if you're seeing large earthworms in your garden, in your soil, those are not jumping worms. Those are your typical European earthworms. So understanding the phenology is really helpful to understanding what species you have. You won't see jumping worms that are anything close to like that until end of May, June probably, depending on your landscape. The other thing that is in red, this red arrow is pointing to a structure on the body called the clitellum. This is where earthworm produce their cocoons. It's kind of the reproductive center of the earthworm. And it presents itself as a ring near the head. Jumping worms, their clitellum is kind of milky white. It contrasts with their body color. It's annular, meaning that it's a full ring around the body. It's a complete ring, and it's smooth. So if you run your finger along the body, it's not a bump. It's at the same level as the rest of the body. Any other earthworm that we have has, their clitellum is raised. It's kind of a pink color, and the most important part is that it does not fully go around the body. It's what we call a saddle shape. So if you were to turn this earthworm over, you'd see that the ends don't meet, okay? And that's the easiest way to tell them apart. When they're mature, when they're fully formed, clitellum is intact. So they're either milky white, fully around, or they're kind of a pinkish raised and they don't fully form a complete ring. The behavior, the term jumping worms probably give that away. Jumping worms are very active. They don't have legs, so they're not physically jumping, but they can thrust their body off the ground. They can snake away. Their body is much more rigid, which allows them to have those sort of, spastic movements. It's disturbing if you've never seen it before. Other earthworms are not like that. They're kind of less active. They're wiggly. I mean, everyone's seen and held an earthworm. They can maybe curl around your finger or creep away, but they don't appear to actively try to get away from you. With jumping worms, they do.
Do they act that way back home too?
Yeah. Yeah. And then finally, their casting behavior. So I mentioned casts are the earthworm's excrement, right? And so even if you don't see any earthworms, even if it's the middle of winter and we have a thawing and you can see the soil, you can tell if you have jumping worm by looking at the granularity of the soil surface. Jumping worms produce this kind of coffee ground like soil signature. It's really granular. Some people describe it as coffee or as taco meat. So think of that like, which I hate using that analogy because I like tacos and that kind of ruins it for me, but that kind of texture. Whereas any other species, they all produce casts, right? But they produce them in sort of little mound here and there. It's not uniform at all. And I'll show this in a photo that'll help, I think. All right. So I mentioned, yes?
Are the jumping worms always active or more so when they disturb?
Is a good question. When they're disturbed. Right. So when they're in the soil just doing their thing, they're just going about their business. But if you dig them up, you find them, then they're gonna. So it's likely some kind of anti-predatory response that they're doing. So this is just a visual of their life cycle. So generally, November through April, they're in their cocoon phase. Okay. Now, in April they start to wake up, and every year it's different because of the weather and when the temperatures warm up. But then May and June is when we have the most small ones. So they're mostly juvenile. They're just growing. And then July through October, most of the earthworms are adult. So they're at this stage. And then the population crashes after that hard freeze, and it's just this circular cycle.
Are the juveniles wiggly?
Yes.
Like the same as the adults?
Yes, same behavior. That's a good one to know too. Even if they're not adult, that behavior is still present. Yep. Cocoons. These are the cocoons. It took us years to figure out how to find them in the soil to do experiments on them. We wanted to test how, heat or different chemicals might interrupt that cycle. But they look like soil, right? They're tiny. They're like 2 millimeters in diameter. You can see the scale there. They look just like little balls of soil. But they're being laid all over this topsoil. And then when those hatch, this is what's produced. This is a 2 centimeter scale roughly. Little baby jumping worm. Sometimes a cocoon can produce 2, but usually it's just 1. The thing that I want you to remember about this, and then it took us a while to figure this out too, is that when they're hatched, they're already pigmented. There are other earthworms called potworms that are kind of translucent. They're the same size, and they're everywhere in the spring. And they're also kind of wiggly and very active. And when we first looking for them in the spring for jumping worms, we were seeing these potworms, these translucent little worms everywhere. And we're like, oh my God, these are jumping worms. They're the same active behavior, similar, but they were clear. And then we figured out, okay, they're not jumping worms because jumping worms, when they hatch, when they come out of cocoon, they're already that kind of brownish color. So that was good. And it's good to know that, like, if you see something else that's translucent, that has that kind of behavior, that's not a jumping worm. Jumping worms are already pigmented when they are born. Okay. Here's the soil. So the left-hand side, this is a single photo of an invasion front at the Arboretum. Left-hand side has jumping worms, has had them for a while. Right-hand side does not, has other earthworms on the right-hand side. And so I think it's clear from the photo here that real granular, uniform granularity of that topsoil on the left-hand side versus the right-hand side, you've got a little bit more leaf litter, but what looks more like typical soil. There are, there are mounds of castings. You can kind of see, so there's castings here, but they're more dispersed, right? So that's what you're looking for. Is it really loose, porous soil on top, or is it just sort of dispersed little casts? Now, this is very academic. Doesn't really matter, but I mentioned earlier that these 3 species of jumping worms tend to co-invade, so you might find them together, and it doesn't really matter because they're doing the same thing, but they're different sizes, and so you might wonder, why is this one so much bigger than the other one? They're different species, and different size, and for earthworms, different size bodies produce different granular sizes too. So on the left-hand side is the largest earthworm, the metaphyre. That earthworm produces larger granular castings versus the tokiensis that produces smaller ones. So you might see a uniform casting layer, but different size casting granules. And that just means that you probably have more than one jumping worm species. Again, it doesn't really matter, but just so you know, that you might see something like this that's not all the same size casting. All right, so hopefully this will work. I got a few videos here to show. So this is a video that we took. We collected some jumping worms, put them for a photo shoot, and let them do their thing. And this is what they look like. So when you have high abundance and you disturb them, they do that kind of behavior, very snake-like. Here's one that's doing that snake-like behavior. So they're very active. And can you see on this video where the clitellum is? Where the head is? Right there. Right? So down here is the clitellum. This is the mouth part and the tail. And then they also have this fun characteristic of being able, when they're handled roughly, to drop part of their body segment. Kind of like some lizards will do, to drop a tail to get away. Some lizards can regrow that. Jumping worms don't regrow that. And see if you can see when it happens there. See that kink in the bottom? And now it's sort of moving independently of the body, and soon it'll just cut off. That is likely an anti-predatory response, trying to get away from a predator and leaving part of its body behind that's still moving to distract it, right? Now, 2 earthworms have not been created here, right? Which is a common question, and a good one. It's basically this earthworm dropped part of its body that will decompose in a matter of days. That earthworm is still viable to become an adult, produce cocoons. And so it's still alive, but it's just one earthworm. It's just dropped part of its body. All right, so earthworms actually as a group have been getting a lot of attention lately in the press because they are moving farther north, and they've been found now in the Arctic, overwintering in the Arctic, which is incredible. Eating that as that permafrost thaws, it's super rich organic matter, and we are a global species, right? We've touched every part of the earth, and jumping worms or earthworms are able to hitch rides, and so climate change, like with everything else, may impact the hatching and growing conditions of jumping worms. But in turn, because of how climate change works, it's not universal. Not every part of the globe is warming. It depends where you are. And sometimes we get warm spells in the winter and then it freezes again, right? And then we get snow and then it thaws. And so one thing that could happen is that it actually benefits, or it does not benefit jumping worms, because if we get thawing events in February, they might hatch. And then we get a freeze, all those worms will die. And so, this is sort of unknown how it'll play out, but there's a lot of different scenarios. Their populations could spread and then crash rapidly if we have a lot of freeze-thaw events. And again, like I said, precipitation, temperature, freeze-thaw events. And this is not unique just to earthworms, but just generally climate change will play a role in the spread. All right, speaking of spread, how are they moving around the landscape? And I've sort of mentioned this already, but they follow organic matter of all types, okay? So that can be compost. They love compost. Hardwood mulch they're found in. They're in leaves. Some communities have like municipal leaf pickups that are used then and respread on as mulch or other materials. They're used for bait, right? Earthworms are used for bait. This gentleman looks like he's probably spread most of the population in North America by himself. They're in soil, or in whether it's in a potted plant or a bag of soil, plant sales, those kind of things, the nursery industry, greenhouses, and then landscaping, those kind of, And this is not to point out any group, any industry. We're working very closely with the green industry in Wisconsin to share information about invasive species generally and how to prevent their spread. This is just how this group travels, right? And so it's something, and we'll talk more about this here in a second, but these are the kind of materials that earthworms as a group generally can spread, but especially jumping worms. And we know that jumping worms can impact our garden, where we often use this kind of material. So garden soil, garden plants. And so remember that all earthworms are not the same, right? We've got, some of them are in the leaf litter, some of them are really deep in the soil, some are annual life cycles, some are perennial. Jumping worms are annual, and they like to be in the top of the soil or in the organic layer. So as gardeners, we forever have been, told and learned that earthworms are good for the garden, right? Like they help us, they move soil around, they move nutrients around, they help water infiltrate through the root zone, and though that is completely true, that is true. But jumping worms, again, they don't perform those services for us because they don't burrow deep, so they're not moving soil and nutrients and water to the root zone. They're just turning over the organic layer on top constantly. And so they're not effective at helping to grow, annual crops, for example, or perennial flowers, for example. Any sort of burrowing is horizontal and not vertical. So they're just working that top layer over and over and over again, creating really loose soil, right? That granular soil. Yeah.
I had a weird experience with, I had purchased a mature, indoor tree, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't thriving, and then the water would just go whoosh right through.
Right through.
And then the soil started coming out the bottom, the grounds came out the bottom. And then one morning there was this worm out in the middle of and again it was just crazy.
Yeah, that sounds.
The weird thing is that I was checking the top of the plant because I thought maybe it has some infestation or something, and there were no worms in the top. They were all living in the base.
Interesting.
Because there's openings.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then, we were what are we going to do? How are we going to be able to salvage this? And so we picked up the plant, and just the whole base was
Just dropped.
writhing with those.
Really?
And
Oh
they
my
were
God.
big,
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
So we ended up having to just get rid of the whole tree, and
Oh,
we just
shoot.
were so freaked out that we threw the whole, bag
Yeah.
and got rid of
Was that in your house? Was it a house plant? Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
so they were actually coming out the bottom
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the holes of the plant.
Yeah.
So I guess I just wanted to say that checking the top does not do it if you have a plant with holes.
Yeah.
They can live in the bottom.
Thank you for saying that's a great point. So I mentioned that, yeah, it's a great point. So I mentioned that they like to live in nature, that they like to be in the top.
Right.
We talk about potted plants, that sort of goes out the window because that soil is, it's put there, it's sort of unconsolidated, and it's basically like a large horizon of soil. It's just it's basically like a large topsoil. You know what I mean? It's not, the whole thing is a good habitat for an earthworm. It's probably potentially been fertilized, has a lot more organic matter than a typical soil profile, so they're not going to be oh, this is the end of the organic matter, I can't eat anymore. They're gonna go, and so it's a much different situation. We're talking about potted plants, yeah, and that sounds exactly like what happened there. Yep.
It kind of makes me think of an ant farm. So maybe we could do something good with them if we had an ant farm thing where they could go through and churn stuff up. Because if we're just doing the top one, but you're talking about the bottom, I've seen these pots, they've got a little air hole down there.
Yeah.
Just thinking about how we can. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, so looking at, we got this invasive species, they have any nutritive value, most Americans wouldn't eat them. They'd be great for fishing, though, wouldn't they, whirling around? I just think about these butterfly farms I started in Kenya. It's okay, people are cutting the trees down, but there's butterflies there, so we can show them these butterflies can make you a lot of money. Like, could these worms make some kid's project that will charge a lot of money because they're great for fishing because they wiggle so much, you know?
Right. As long as, one of the things about fishing is as long as the unused bait is disposed of properly. Right.
A bucket of calcium.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. So that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, it's and so in a sort of a natural system, they behave one way in a potted, and the thing is that they probably have been in that pot for a while before you bought it, and they produce this abundance of earthworms, and they created this super porous soil that the roots could not adhere to, and that's what we're finding in a place like the Arboretum, where we can't plant into these areas that have had jumping worms for a long time because there's no structure for the roots to hold. Yeah.
Like just right on through.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, and here's kind of what you were just saying too, is this granularity, this porous soil, challenging for roots of, for sure, annual plants. Now, there are some perennial plants in a garden system, especially native plants, the deep-rooted ones, that might be okay for a while. Like, their roots are deep enough where jumping worms won't, at least in the short term, have much impact. But eventually, they could, and even when you affect the top layer of soil, that in turn affects what's happening below at some level, right? Because it's changing that sort of micro hydrological system around the roots. Again, some of the nutrients may be leached away from that plant because of what's happening with the upper layers. And in here I mentioned that they can even eat, at high abundance, they can eat plant roots, which probably happened to some of the roots of that potted plant. They will eat turfgrass roots. I've gone to neighbors' houses at the Arboretum where you can just peel back their turf. Yeah, and so those turf roots are already small, and they're really fine, and so it was like a carpet. It was incredible, and that's at really extreme abundance. So, all right, how do I know? Make sure I use our timer. How do I know if I have jumping worms on my property? Well, we talked about how to differentiate the two types of worms, right? One of the things, frankly, being here is a good start. Education, right? Looking for jumping worms and signs of their presence. So the granularity, the casting layer, understanding what a jumping worm looks like, that's the first thing. The second thing you can do is to conduct what's called a mustard pour. It's a mustard extraction method. As a researcher, this is what I use all the time to sample for earthworms. It's cheap, it's safe, and it's really easy to do. And what you do, and I'll provide some resources here later on, but it's dry mustard powder that you can get from co-op. I buy mine from a restaurant wholesale company in like the 50-pound box of just dried mustard, not fancy mustard, just yellow mustard. You mix about a cup with a gallon of water. Shake it up really well, and what happens, and I'll show this a picture in a moment, you pour it on the ground, and it trickles down, and any earthworm will come to the surface because it irritates their skin. So they're taking in moisture through pores in their skin, and so that the thought is that the mustard is a skin irritant, and their reaction is to vertically burrow out of that situation, and then you can just pick them up. It does not kill them, does not kill your plants, and it's safe to handle, right? It's a food product. So here's what it looks like. So we've cleared away a small area of leaves. This is the soil, and they will come quick because they're already at the surface or close to it. You start to see them come up in the bottom, and you can just pick, and there you go. So this could be a control potential if you If you have a really small infestation, you just found it and you just want to get rid of the ones that you can find, pick them out. This is labor intensive. If you have like an acre garden or half acre garden, you're not going to pour the entire thing with this mustard solution. But you can at least find out what, if you have jumping worm. If you have a spot where it's like, this is really granular, I'm going to see what's here. That's kind of what it's really useful for. My kids love to do this. Teachers love, this is a great teacher activity for kids. Because any earthworm will come to the surface. And you can see what you have for an earthworm community in your yard. And also,
How big of a square area can 1 gallon?
for 1 gallon, it can be at least this size. It kind of depends. If it's really dry, then you want to do less because the soil will soak it up. If it's like normal,
Wait till a month from now.
yeah, normal moisture conditions, it'll infiltrate down quite a ways, and you'll get a lot of different. Depending on what you have, you'll get those. All right. So besides the mustard pour solution, what can we do about jumping worms? First of all, I've already mentioned, educate yourself and others about what they are. Don't be afraid to ask questions of, if you're purchasing mulch from a garden store, from a hardware store, being able to ask a question about, do you know where this mulch came from? And I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a moment. If you're buying potted plants from a nursery, hey, what do you do about jumping worms? Do you have them? Do you not have them? And hopefully they'll be forthright with you about them. My experience is that I'm working with nurseries and garden shops. It's in their best interest to not have them, or at least be forthright with you about what they're doing. Because it's okay if these are present. It's what are you doing about it? Are you making sure that your products are over here and you're working with a clean soil and a clean product, and that's the best situation. When you're working in your yard, or if you move to your neighbor's yard or to a community garden, just make sure that your equipment is clean when you leave. And when you come back to your own place, that you're leaving clean. So arrive clean, leave clean, your tools are clean, your shoes, maybe you have a little boot brush. And that's for any kind of invasive, seeds or whatever. That's just a good best management practice. The one thing that we know that will work on earthworms and their cocoons is heat. So we know that the cocoons cannot survive temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's research that we've done at the Arboretum. And the research that we did was looking at the state compost standards. So almost all states have a commercial compost standard. So if you're a composter, you have to heat your compost to a certain temperature for a certain amount of time to reduce harmful pathogens, bacteria that might be hanging out in that compost. So if you're buying from a reputable compost company in Wisconsin, they have to heat their pile to 55 degrees Celsius for at least 3 days. Okay, so that's well above what needs to happen to kill cocoons. And so with that knowledge, we can also think about how do we use that temperature on our own gardens, our own land. And we know that fire as a tool is used to manage savannas and prairies as an ecosystem, but fire/heat can also be used to manage our own properties at small scale. It gets tricky when we are incorporating flame and heat in our backyard. It's not always possible, right? So what are ways that we can apply heat? One way that people are using with some success is solarization. So this time of year, even earlier, if you have an appropriate condition in your backyard, maybe you're south-facing, more open garden systems, using clear plastic, kind of creating that greenhouse effect. Think of your car in the summer. The windshield creates a greenhouse effect internally. That's what we're doing to our soil. And those cocoons we know are going to be in that top layer, just hanging out. If we can solarize that, maybe you can see there's a kind of a thermometer, a meat thermometer to track temperature. It will not take long to reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not very hot for solarization. For a couple of days, then that's about as good as you can do in terms of ease of applying heat, safety, and then you can feel good. You can feel like, hey, I did what I can in my soil to make sure that those cocoons are dead. If you have a small amount of soil, you can heat soil, sort of sterilize the soil. You can use a torch if you want. A lot of people are trying that. I don't recommend that just because of, that people may not be comfortable doing that. But that is sort of instant cocoon death, right? That you don't have to be out there for 3 days doing that. That's just like instant. Yeah.
So, I'm sure many people know people here who have chickens.
Yes.
And so it doesn't hurt them in any way. It's actually nutritious for them. So they can
Right.
go and scratch around in a leaf litter and keep the population
Yeah.
that way as well.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah.
Do they eat the cocoons?
Good question. I don't know. Yeah. I'd be really curious if they were presented with cocoons, what they would do. I mean, they look like little seeds. Maybe? Yeah. Yeah. If they could find them. Yeah. Yeah. I'd be really curious. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good one. There is, again, like I don't recommend any sort of chemical control. There are options out there. The one though that is, if you're interested in this sort of thing, this is an organic product. It's called Botanigard that is already commercially available for this type of use. It's for any soft-bodied sort of garden pests, things like slugs, springtails, those sort of things. And it's a naturally occurring fungus called Beauveria bassiana. And so they've basically taken this fungus into and made it into a commercial formulation. And there is research behind this product for jumping worms, where it's fairly effective at, again, reducing the earthworms. It does not affect cocoons. It does not penetrate the cocoons. So again, these sort of things, whether you're using this product, people have tried vinegar and soaps. Those will kill earthworms. They will not affect cocoons. So those products are multiple year applications, and there's always residual impacts to be aware of, right? They could kill beneficial things in your soil that you may not want to disturb. Things like vinegar, soaps will change probably the pH of your soil and affect plant roots. So again, these things are not always applicable to every site.
Where was this research done?
Vermont.
Vermont.
Yeah,
Names coming from Vermont.
yeah. Joseph Gores, he's done a lot of earthworm work, particularly jumping worm work, since Vermont was sort of one of the epicenters of the invasion. All right, I want to run through that. I know we're getting past time here. Other things to try. So in terms of control or preventing the spread, again, they love organic matter. That's their food source. So that's something just to keep in mind. Organic matter in a lot of forms. So one thing to think about in your garden, if you have them, is to consider reducing the amount of wood mulch that you use. Now, that's hard to do because wood mulch has a lot of benefits to our plants. We need to use some sort of mulch for weed control, hold moisture and nutrients. So that may not be a great option to reduce that. Instead, if you don't have jumping worms and you've been using mulch for a long time, continue purchasing from that supplier or using the mulch where you're getting it from. That's great. If you do have them, then maybe experiment with other forms of mulch. Things like grass mulch, maybe either native grass mulch, like prairie mulch, or hay, straw. Those forms of mulch are much less palatable to earthworms. The amount of nitrogen versus carbon in those are much different than, say, maple leaves or basswood leaves or hardwood mulch that breaks down much quicker and is much more accessible to earthworms to consume than something like straw or hay or any kind of grass mulch. And then, like I mentioned, experiment with heat application, whether it's solarization, some kind of steam treatment. And in terms of, there's not much research happening. Well, there's some research happening, but really we're kind of looking to folks like you that are gardening and like thinking about these, like what works in your yard to control, in a maybe more like a non-invasive way, control some of these pests, and maybe it's more chickens. I mean, honestly, like some biological controls like that. That might be a great idea. All right, second to last page here. Resources. The DNR website has great resources. I actually maintain that site as well, so I try and keep the latest information up there. University of Minnesota Extension has a great website. Cornell has like some really good kind of homeowner sheets, fact sheets to print out. And then the Great Lakes Worm Watch is out of the University of Minnesota Duluth. If you're interested in earthworms generally, it's a really interesting site to learn about earthworms. How to make that mustard solution, the recipe is on that website. All sorts of fun facts you can find there. And then finally, it could be worse. We could be dealing with this earthworm. This is the largest earthworm in the world. It's the giant Gippsland earthworm from Australia. It is a 9 to 12 foot long earthworm, native to Australia. Australia has all the best things, all the largest critters, and people find these earthworms all the time in there. So we could, maybe someday we'll have this one. That'd be pretty fun. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'll take questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have.
Yeah.
So you talked about the jumping worms going up to the Arctic.
Yeah.
And the permafrost melting.
Yeah.
People are concerned about the permafrost melting because of the release of methane.
Yep.
So when jumping worms eat that
Yeah.
nutrient layer, what does that do to the methane?
The methane, I don't know exactly. I'm not sure about the methane, but what happens when earthworms are turning over that organic layer, they are increasing the mineralization rate of carbon. So there is a release of carbon dioxide, and that's been shown. A release of nitrogen and phosphorus. So that's when you talk about decomposition, that's what's happening, right? You're releasing these nutrients, and earthworms do that rapidly, very quickly. And so my thought is they're probably, as with methane, that they are speeding up that process even more. So it's an acceleration of a natural process. In the Arctic, it's going to be even more dramatic because there's such a high level of, in this case, methane that's been trapped in the permafrost and now being released. And what happens when you do have a warming, it's actually, it creates this positive loop where you have a warming, and because the snow now and the ice is removed, it's able, the solar radiation, it becomes more intense. And then you add earthworms in the system, and so it's just like, it's a rapid release of all sorts of things, methane probably being one of them. So yeah.
Do their castings, like when they decompose, they release methane?
I don't know. I don't know about methane in particular. So the castings are interesting because the castings, for a while at least, will trap nutrients. So the castings are actually nutrient rich and are often sold in like what's called organic fertilizer. Like castings are really rich. And so they can actually trap carbon and nutrients for a while. But they're also, especially with jumping worms, that creates a really erodible soil layer. They're just this porous soil. And so those are going to be mobilized into a waterway and transported. And once they're in water, then they can break down and re-release that carbon and nutrients. So it's a complicated cycle and really depends on the landscape configuration of what's going to happen. And it's something that, especially when you talk about the Arctic, like we really don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we can sort of think, especially with methane, I think generally it would increase the amount of methane released, unfortunately, but that's to be seen. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
It used to be that farmers and even gardeners would rotate by leaving a section fallow of their croplands.
Yeah.
And we often don't do that anymore.
Right.
But I'm wondering about this water and drought and
Yeah.
heat treatments, that if you put a section of your garden or your field into fallow for
Yeah.
a year or two, and then could you flood it for a period of time? Could you let it dry out by covering it? I mean, could you do something like that and not try to grow a crop on it, but just intensively treat it? And then what about the calcium? Is there enough range of normal calcium in the soil that you want in the soil? Is the range adequate that you could up the calcium enough without screwing up your ratios in the soil to make the worms unhappy with the calcium?
Yeah.
Build some calcium into the
Really good points. The calcium question, I don't know a lot about that. I don't know.
If you soil tested it,
Right.
you were
That's the thing you could do. Right. Then you could add some. Yeah.
saturate your soil with a higher level of calcium, and maybe that would.
Yep.
Is that high enough?
Right. Still be in the range where it's the soil, it's a healthy soil to grow crops, but high enough to, right.
Do you know what level of calcium the worms don't like?
I don't know offhand. I don't know what the specific level is.
Would they have data on that, because they found out the worms don't like?
Right. Yes, there is data on that. Yeah, I don't know offhand though.
So if you knew that level in the soil, then you could look at your own soil
Yeah.
and go, can I dose my soil?
Right. Yeah. Where's that sweet spot where? Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah.
So perhaps a step before that, Susan, might be to go onto that land and do a muster test, find out if we have.
Oh, yeah, you wouldn't want.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that might be very good for the KVR to start surveying areas and keep a record.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be very interested just what the communities are at KVR, like earthworm communities generally, because I mean, given this is driftless area.
It's rich soil and has maple basswood forest.
Yeah. So.
Moisture. It's
Yeah.
got everything
Yeah.
that they like.
Yeah. Very good idea. Yeah.
So I bought some topsoil, which I ended up knowing that it did have.
Yeah. Yep.
So I put it down, put a new walkway in, so down each side of the walk.
Okay.
And I had some left over, I put it in my vegetable garden.
Yeah.
Anyway, I noticed that I had jumping worms because I put some in a pot.
Okay.
A pot inside, and then I realized that I had it.
Yeah.
I panicked, and I did solarize,
Okay.
and then do it for 1 or 2 weeks. I don't know. Maybe I left it on. So
Yeah.
I polarized it for a year.
Okay.
And then I looked for it. And then I ended up just like, I don't care if I kill anything. I
Yeah.
put vinegar on it.
Yeah. Yep.
I killed the
Yeah.
grass that I was trying to grow. So for 2 years,
Yeah.
I pretty much had plastic
True. Yeah.
As far as I know, and then we had the drought.
Yeah.
I don't.
You haven't found them
found
since?
them again.
Wow.
I don't know.
Interesting.
Maybe I should test more, but. No.
That's great.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, yeah.
You know, I worry, like all of a sudden, any kind of worm, I'm like, okay, is that which one? And they usually are just real.
The other
you know,
typical other one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
European
Yeah.
worms that aren't like.
Yeah. Well, that's a good story though, because I think it is, this idea of like integrative pest management, like multiple techniques are probably important.
I did leave it on for like the whole, well.
Yeah.
The sidewalk, in the vegetable garden, it got direct sun. So
Okay.
I left it on for a year, and it was
Okay.
a big deal.
Yeah.
On the side of the walk, it did get a lot, it was somewhat shady.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I did the vinegar.
Okay.
So I figured, I'm like, I don't care what I kill.
Yeah.
I don't want it to move on, and
Yeah.
I haven't seen evidence, but
Yeah.
it's been dry. So
Yeah.
maybe that helped too.
But maybe, those three things together might have been like those multiple stressors might have been the thing. Yeah. Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
After they've been in the soil for a number of years, and you get that real coffee ground
Yep.
kind of soil, and there isn't any litter on the top of the ground,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't there be a point where they kind of would just run out of fuel?
Yeah. That's a
And then they
good
would
point.
like a lot of invasives, we just don't have much timeline or patience.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
most of the plants we look at here are invasive, the
Yeah.
plants, lace, all that
Yeah.
stuff.
There's a lot.
We learn to live with it.
Yeah.
It comes and goes
Yeah.
in an area, so would they possibly fade out in places because they don't have any bees?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I've noticed is they need organic matter to survive. I mean, they need like some layer of food. And so if you remove that food source, like they might have enough in the soil for a while, but yeah, they will have to move to find food, for sure. And so that's an option. But of course, then if you want to grow something, like you need to put some kind of amendment down to actually use the soil for what you want to use it for. But yeah, in theory, they would move on. Now, even if they move on and then okay, now we're good. We'll put mulch back here and do stuff. The cocoons that are there will probably hatch again, and then there is not a single season treatment. I don't think that you'd have to over.
How many years do the cocoons have?
Yeah, we don't know. From what I have, I think around. I mean, at least 3, I would say, and maybe not much more than that, but 3 is something that we've seen at least. Yeah. So, I mean, it's from an ecological and evolutionary perspective, they're really interesting. I mean, they're highly adaptive. I mean, think about what they've made it so that their cocoons can be really hard to kill. For an annual species, that's like they're putting a lot of resources into that part of the life cycle because that's what has to survive the next year. But it makes controlling them really difficult. And again, I think it's good to know too that, like you were mentioning, there's invasive species come and go, and we do adapt. Like we do learn to sort of live with certain things now and then, and there could be plants. There for sure will be plants that don't care about jumping worms. What they are, we don't know exactly. There's some plants that probably will adapt over time. One of the studies that I'm writing up now, it was basically, and maybe some of you were even involved in this, but I sent out a survey about what plants are you seeing in your garden that you can attribute to jumping worm effects? Are there any plants that you're seeing that, everything being equal, the only explanation is that I have jumping worms in that area, and that I think is the cause. And I've collected about 1,000 responses from people from Midwest and New England area, and I'm trying to put together kind of a list of plants that people have said, these are always a problem. The jumping worms always affect these, whereas, you know, these hostas like don't care about jumping worms. And these whatever plants, like sometimes, you know, so there are these lists out there of plants that do well under black walnut, right, for example, or are deer resistant. You know, deer don't like them as much. So that's kind of the idea that I have of like, have some like sort of list of plants that, whether they're like ornamental, you know, vegetable, native, whatever plants that if I had jumping worms, like, okay, maybe I don't want to spend money on these types of plants and I'll have to go towards these plants. So like adapting, because getting rid of earthworms as, you know, jumping worms as fully eradication is probably not going to happen unless you know right away that you have them and you can get rid of them that way. But once they're established, it's really probably challenging to get rid of them, although maybe not.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, so, but, yeah.
How did those worms get into Earth? Did we bring them, or can the cocoons travel with air?
Good question. So the cocoons can travel any number of ways. They can travel, they're primarily traveling through the movement of like horticultural materials. So in bagged mulch, compost, you know, embedded on our shoe tread and soil. They can also, what we found actually at the Arboretum, where we have some forests that are on kind of hillside, we think what happened, we get these heavy rain events, and that real granular soil on top also has cocoons, and they're traveling down footpaths into other areas that didn't have them, and then they're getting established downstream. Same with creeks and stream. If they get in there, they're traveling downstream and then maybe getting established that way. So the cocoons are pretty amazing. They're really hardy, and they can move. So that's generally how they're moving around the landscape in short distances and then long distances through, you know, plant trade and commercial plants.
Are you looking in your plant survey at prairie plants if they aren't really going into that terrain?
Right.
What selection of prairie plants might grow in those edge areas?
Right.
Or even in some shade, in the woods that they don't like? I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like that's a rich place to be looking for things they don't live in.
Right, yeah. So like, for sure, prairie plants, and I think it's hard to tease out like specific plants in a prairie, but there's something about that they don't like, and it might be that.
Well, most of the nutrients are way underground.
That's part.
Plants can survive burning.
Right. The roots are deep roots. Right. Exactly.
So they aren't accessible to the worms.
Might not be the plant,
Right.
it's the structure of the environment.
It could be the structure too, and there's not.
Not as much for them to eat.
Right. And there's not much to eat, right? And like the grasses are a much different type of organic matter than a leaf, and they're not as palatable. Right, all those things, yeah. So something is different about it. Yeah. Yeah.
So in one of your first slides, you mentioned they like people's lungs and some kind of forest, right?
Right.
So would that be maybe a function of pH, maybe some microelements that people put into their lungs that they like? And is there certain types of forest trees and species that they prefer and the ones that they absolutely don't like?
Yeah, good question. So the second part of that, so yes, leaf litter comes in all what we refer to as like high quality leaf litter in terms of its ability to be eaten by organisms. So maple and basswood are high quality litter for earthworms. They decompose rapidly and then are consumed easily by earthworms. Things like oak are not as palatable. So like oak savannas, oak woodlands, while they can be in there, they're less likely to be at high abundance because, oak leaves will stick around for a while. They'll hang on the trees for longer. And then things like pine needles are not super palatable to jumping worms. So like cherry, basswood, maple, they're gonna eat that up. Oaks, less. Pines, much less.
What about pH?
So you're asking if there's a certain pH that they, yeah. That kind of goes hand in hand with the type of litter, because the type of litter will often drive the pH of the soil. So in generally lower pH, they don't do as well in. So pine forest often has a lower, more acidic soil they don't like. The soils that I find them in is more neutral, maybe slightly acidic, so around like high 5 to 6 pH, they'll do fine. Anything lower than that, though, it's too acidic. So yeah, in your typical maple forest, it's probably going to be around a 6 pH, give or take, and they'll do fine. But it also depends on, so like a sandier soil, they don't do well in a sandy, granular soil, and those usually can have a higher or a lower pH. But then on the other side of things, a real muck soil, they don't do well in that either. So again, that gets back to the moisture requirements. They like a more typical moisture, what we call like mesic forests. So that's what we've seen, at least to this point. Yep. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate you being here. Yeah.